Joining us today. My name is Kelly Hall, and I will be your host. Today's webinar should be about 25 minutes with time for a short Q&A at the end, so please feel free to submit any questions you may have to the Q&A box anytime throughout the webinar. Today we have our Head of Security Research, Sean Evans, here to speak about today's topic, which is how hackers exploit weak passwords. Sean, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi Kelly. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everybody for attending. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Sean Evans. I am the head of security research here at NopSec, so I'm looking forward to discussing password security with everyone. So with that, we will begin. So the goal of this webinar today is to just help you learn how hackers exploit weak passwords and the consequences of that, and we'll gain some best practice recommendations on how you can improve password management within your organization, and some harsh realities too. So without any further delay, let's get into it. All right. Today we're going to be covering what is the characteristics of a weak password, and conversely, what are the characteristics of a strong password. The consequences that having weak passwords can have on your organization, how hackers actually actively exploit weak passwords, and we'll go over some use cases. These are my personal war stories, so it'll be coming purely from experience how I've exploited the presence of weak passwords in enterprise environments. And then finally, how to better protect your organization, and we'll open up the forum to some questions and answers. So what makes a password hackable? There's a number of things that kind of go into it, and there's a lot of things that we abuse when we're doing a penetration assessment to try to gain unauthorized access to these critical resources. And one of the things we look for is same as your login info, so admin, admin, guest, guest. We'll try to identify things that were just hastily set up, and in the just for the ease of use, somebody set the password equal to a username, which is a classic no-no, and it's going to be something that by default most password cracking tools will try. There's keyboard patterns, so ASDF, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's a common one. ASDF 1, 2, 3, 4. You see that in a lot of development deployments where it's something that was hastily thrown up. It's a MySQL server database that nobody really cares about or was forgotten about. It was there to support some test case for a developer. It was never taken down, and it's prone to trivial guessing attacks. There's common passwords. These are going to be things season plus year, month plus year, password 1. There's actually a list of 25 most common passwords that's annually released. On there is monkey, secret, password 1, baseball you see pop up frequently. The top 10 are probably always the same in those lists, but the season in the year and the month in the year are kind of interesting because they are a direct result of password change policies, which is an interesting consequence of using a password change policy because it's good. It doesn't keep your, it keeps your passwords fresh, they're not stale, but because end users oftentimes have a difficult time remembering what the password is, they choose an easy algorithm to make it memorable. So, winter 2017, December 2016. It's just an easy way to say, okay, I will not repeat myself because there's oftentimes history rules that go along with it. So, you can't reuse a password that you've used in your last 6 passwords, which makes it difficult to maintain complex passwords in some of these environments, and that's why you find season and year and month and year so regularly. There's dictionary words. These are going to be, this is a weird way to put it, but any word we use is technically a dictionary word. But there are word lists out there that attackers use frequently. Some of them ship by default with open source password cracking utilities such as John the Ripper, but these are going to be any word that's present in one of these dictionaries in its raw form. So it's a one-to-one relationship between your password and something in this dictionary. Those are going to be crackable just because of the these password lists are easily accessible, publicly available, and used widely within the penetration testing industry. Default passwords, guest is one, Cisco, admin password is a popular one, Tomcat manager. But you definitely want to eliminate default passwords because, anytime we're on assessment, we're going to look at whatever the asset is we're assessing and say, oh, okay, so this is a D-Link device. I wonder what the common default passwords are for this specific D-Link device. And we'll go in and try to crack it. And then password reuse. So this is just the instance where you might have some trivial site, where you just wanted to post a comment to some forum, and you happen to reuse the same exact password on that site as you have on your email. So you don't want a situation where this, weakly protected website that you've reused a password on is cracked, hacked. Some attacker gains access to the clear text passwords, but then he can use that password to authenticate to your Gmail, which is much, much more critical. So you don't want to reuse passwords like that across various applications and contexts. So that's basically what makes them crackable. More goes into it, but we'll get into that a little bit later when we make some distinctions between password guessing and password cracking. So what makes a password secure? So how can you actually protect yourself against individuals like myself? The main thing you want to do is to have a large key space, and this just means that you have maximized the number of possible combinations of data that you're including in your password. So this is going to be mixed case, which is upper and lower, digits, 0 through 9, and special characters, which is going to be your, hold and shift, hit any number, and that's a special character, more or less. And what this does is effectively increases the amount of time that an attacker would have to, the maximum number of exhaustive passwords that could be in a given password. So if you only included lowercase letters and digits, the key space is exponentially lower than if you included mixed case plus special characters. You want to make sure that you have sufficient length and entropy. So this just means, length is obvious. That 8 characters or more is kind of the old standard, and I would say 10 characters is probably for the safe side. Go ahead and go with that. For whatever reason, there's sometimes critical sites out there that still limit you at times to 12-character maximum, which I don't understand at all, but some sites do it. So you might be limited by the application that you're actually inputting a password into or setting a password on. And entropy just refers to the amount of randomness within the password. So is it easily guessed? Is there predictive elements of the password where if you got a fraction of the password, could you guess the rest of the password? Oftentimes that is the case, but if you have sufficient entropy, that is not necessarily 100% true. So, make it as random as you can, but still easy to remember. And these are the difficult balances that you have to kind of rely on when you're trying to set a secure password. So we said that you want to avoid dictionary words, so use nonsense words in place of these. So these could be something you say, some phonetic word that's just, sounds like a sound like, squawk-a-doodle. You probably won't find that in a password dictionary, so it's a good nonsense word to use. You could use misspelled words. So, replace QU with a K or something that's phonetically similar so it's easy to remember, but it's not going to be present in a dictionary. And you can also use phrases. So, Mary had a little lamb with, fleece as white as snow. You could have something that long. You probably don't want to have a nursery rhyme, verbatim, flip it up, make it funny, do something that makes it memorable, but also it won't be present in a dictionary or prone to trivial guessing attacks. Two-factor authentication is a very, very good way to make a password secure. It's not even really password security, it's more authentication control security, but this is a good protection to have even for people that have weak passwords. So let's say I'm the attacker, I have your password, but the resource I'm attacking utilizes two-factor authentication. Well, in this case, I have to provide something I know, which is my password, and something I have, which is going to be the PIN on your RSA ID key fob, or now they have applications with Google Authenticator or Secure ID, whatever vendor you have, it's the same solution. Something you know, something you have. It's a good way to protect critical resources, even in the presence of weak password, which we'll get into why it's tough to eliminate those. And you want to have one password per authentication context, and this just means that you don't want to reuse passwords. So if it's Gmail, have your Gmail account. You don't want your Gmail account to be the same as your work account, so on and so forth. So it's obvious, but it gets increasingly difficult to remember that many different passwords that are all secure and not crackable. So we'll kind of get into how we can have a secure password, but also make it easy to remember at the same time. So what happens if you have a weak password in your environment? It's pretty obvious you're going to gain access to something that somebody doesn't want you to gain access to, because that's the entire purpose of the password, is to make sure that you are the only person that can gain authorized access to this information or data or application, whatever the case may be. but it'll lead to the compromise of IT assets and security control. So, like, I think a lot of the times people think, oh, well, people will get in my email, and I have a lot of sensitive personal information in there, which I'm sure is true for everybody. But when you think about it in terms of an enterprise organization, if you have default passwords on devices, it's not just the sensitive information. It could be the control of a very, very critical device. So it could be a Cisco router, So suddenly the traffic of everybody within an organization is funneling through this device, and I have, root access to it. So I can read the logs, I can take PCAPs, I can do a whole lot of damage and a whole lot more than I would if I was just an attacker sitting in your network. So that's what we mean by compromise of IT assets and security controls. It could be your, Splunk, log aggregators. It could be any number of things. That's why limiting default passwords is just such a critical part of security in general, and just deploying, having those host hardening policies prior to deployment. Sensitive data exfiltration, it's a big one. If you have weak passwords protecting SMB shared resources, for example. So if you have weak passwords in your Windows domain, that can open up the floodgates for financial data, HR information. You could find web routes out there to intellectual property, design diagrams, whatever the security controls are protecting, you'll gain access to. And ultimately, what we find in doing all of these internal network penetration assessments, and we leverage weak passwords just every single assessment we're on, is that one password is all you need to compromise an entire Windows domain. And that might seem crazy, but we'll get into the details of how that's possible and why this is so critical to remediating, but also difficult to remediate. And finally, you have loss of confidentiality and integrity. So, if I gain read-write access to some shared resource, or I am able to make kind of like a watering hole attack. So I can change the integrity of data hosted on a web page to disseminate false information, change it to spread malware, something like that. That would be loss of integrity. And confidentiality is really hand-in-hand with sensitive data exfiltration, where you are no longer the only individual able to view this confidential information. All right, so guessing passwords versus cracking passwords, and I think there's a lot of misconception about exactly what each of these things are. So when we refer to password guessing, when we're doing a penetration assessment, we're almost always talking about password attacks executed against services. So it's going to be SMB, SSH, basic HTTP authentication, FTP, pretty much anything on a network that will present to you a login prompt or anticipate that you're going to submit credentials to it. So, MySQL is another good one. SQL Server is another good one. And there's a lot of tools out there that you can do password guessing attacks with, but the two primary ones that we use are THC Hydra and Medusa. And both of these kind of do the same thing. Each one has their own strengths, but your attacks on password guessing are oftentimes limited. It's limited by bandwidth. There's only so many password attempts you could do in a finite amount of time, because you got to get the response from the server, and if it's not successful, try again. So you're oftentimes limited to maybe at most 100 guesses per second, and even that is generous. Oftentimes you find that it's around 10 per second if you really, really wanted to hammer on a service, and that's really the robust ones. And it requires a list of valid usernames to even begin that attack, because it's a credential pair. It's not just a password that you're after. It's two pieces of information, username and password. So that's password guessing, and password cracking assumes that there has already been a breach. So this is an instance where you have access to a password hash. So this could be MD5 if I happen to pop MySQL, NTLM if I happen to dump a domain controller. And really the only limitations to password cracking are time and computing power. So when you have a hash, some hashes are computationally more difficult to crack than others. MD5 is pretty simple. LM, dead simple. LM you can actually do with a rainbow table. So that's like a whole other end of it. That because of the small key space of an LM password, it only has uppercase and digits effectively. So you can, digits and special characters, so you can roll through everything pretty quickly. NTLM still computationally weak, easy to go through thousands of them per second with enough computing power. And what you can do with password cracking is use rules to algorithmically permutate passwords. And what this means is that you can take a relatively simple password dictionary, and I kind of will go back to the John the Ripper one. The John the Ripper dictionary, I think, includes something like 3,200 passwords or so. It's a ballpark figure. We'll even call it 3,000, but it's around there. Uh, and it's, decently complex. If you just wanted to try your bare minimum dictionary-based attack against some authentication control that had no account lockout policy, it's a good place to start. But if you're doing password cracking, what you can do is take that simple dictionary and apply rules that permutate the passwords algorithmically. So it might be flipping the case of all of the characters in a password. It might be prepending digits, 0000 to 99999, whatever the case may be. There's a rule to satisfy that. And the rules can get very, very complex and exponentially grow the complexity of a simple password dictionary. And what we oftentimes do during assessments is create maybe a 10-word dictionary, something very simple, but it's very specific to our client. So, if my client was Widget Builders Inc., we're going to have a password dictionary that maybe has widget builder, W builder, widget one, WB1, and on the surface it looks like a very, very simple password dictionary. But when you apply these rules that can change each password into an equivalent of 32,000 unique passwords, you exponentially increase the likelihood that you'll guess a password, even though you have a simple dictionary. So that's how we use rules to kind of push the results in our favor. And you can do dictionary or brute force or a combination of those two attacks. And what brute force refers to, and I think it's oftentimes misused, is exhaustively trying every possible combination of characters in a given key space. So if we define the key space as, upper, lower digits and special characters, it's going to take a long time to brute force that. And the maximum you're going to be able to do is probably 8 characters. And that's given some of the most powerful computers on the planet. When you go up to 9 or 10 characters, the key space is so big, and the number of possible combinations of those values increases exponentially till you hit a point at 8 characters where it's like, okay, it'll take 42 days to crack this password. When you make the next jump up, it goes into years, and then hundreds of years beyond that. So the amount of computing power required to crack passwords over 8 characters is significant. That's why oftentimes you just find that people do dictionary-based attacks, or you can do a brute force mask attack, which just says, okay, well, I'm pretty confident that in the first 4 characters of this password, they're going to be digits, and the last 4 characters, we're going to say those are going to be alphanumeric, and create a mask for that, and then you can kind of do a brute force in those key spaces. And when you limit the key space of specific positions within a password, it makes it computationally feasible to try more complex passwords to a degree, but it limits the amount of exhaustive possibilities. Dictionary just refers to what we already kind of talked about, which is a list of words that you think might be representative of what your hash might resolve to in clear text. So it's just a flat text file. You can have any combination of them. There's tons of them available on the internet that you can download for free, but probably the most popular one is RockU. It's been around for a decade now, probably more. But I know I've been using it for a while, and every time there's a major breach, I'm pretty sure all of the pen testers go out to grab up the goods. So I kind of want to go over how weak passwords factor into a kill chain that can actually result in the entire demise of an organization, or the Windows domain within an organization, and even how the Windows domain could then be compromised to attack the Linux side of the house. So we'll get into it, but the bottom line is that the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And you can go from one account to domain admin, and this is something, and this might be, we do this like 100% of the time. It's like an incredibly reliable, repeatable methodology, and it's almost entirely related to the size of the organization that we're performing an assessment against. So we happen to work a lot with medium and large size enterprises. So they have large Windows domains, in excess of, 4,000 to 5,000 users when you take their global Active Directory server into account. So What we do when we get in, we try to hack that one account with a weak password. They're out of 4,000 people. There is always that guy that is like winter 2016 or password one. There's always that one account. It might not even be an employee. It might be an account that was set up for development purposes like 4 years ago that somebody completely forgot about, but just happens to be live and active on the domain. So once you have that one weak account, and oftentimes we get, we mentioned that you need a username list. One of the ways we always get these username lists is by exploiting misconfigurations on domain controllers. So we'll hit up the domain controller and say, hey, what information can you tell me? I don't have any authentication credentials, but I just want to pump as much data out of you as I possibly can, and it's called a null session. So we do that, and if we're lucky, if it's misconfigured, we can dump a complete list of all the usernames that are present on the domain. That's the first step. Then we try password one. That's the second step. We got the weak account. After we identify that valid authentication credential pair, we will begin to enumerate what kind of permissions that account has across the domain. So, what SMB shares does that user have access to? And, once we aggregate and digest that list, we will start looking at the data that's contained within all of those SMB shares. And there is a surprising level of consistency to finding web.config files in these things. Now, I don't know why, but the web roots of, every big client that I've ever really assessed, there's always been some SMB share that has a forgotten web root on it. And invariably, inside of that web.config file are clear text SQL Server passwords. I know now they have, at least with Server 2012, I think there's mitigations, and it might even be 2008, where you don't have to store the clear text passwords in a web.config file, which is great. Because you don't want anybody to be able to gain trivial access to one of these things and then do the next step, which is use those creds that you've harvested from the web.config in other areas. So the conventional wisdom is that the weak account that we have found is probably not very privileged. You assume that it has very, very basic privileges. Domain access or domain user is probably the only group that it's a member of. Once you get that web.config, though, you're suddenly using database credentials. And database users are likely going to have greater permissions within the domain. And at the very least, they're going to have access to a database server, which may or may not have XP command shell enabled on it. The whole goal of the exercise of continuously finding credentials, analyzing SMB shares, is to elevate our permissions to the point where we find that one system where we have administrative access on. And once we gain that admin access, we have remote command execution capabilities. And what we mean by admin access is you have at least read access to $$ or admin $ on one of your SMB hosts deployed on your network. As soon as you get that, remote command execution is a thing. So from there, we can escalate privileges to system, dump the hashes, do a pass the hash attack, and suddenly we can figure out exactly, how many systems we have admin access on. And oftentimes what you find is that there's a local, password reuse goes so deep in these organizations, and it's easy to see why. You have weak passwords, that's one thing, but then let's assume that a system is off the network. Some system administrator has to physically go down to this machine and log into it. And if that's the case, they're going to be using a local admin password, or maybe a cache password, but more often than not, a local admin password. And for the sake of management purposes, so a limited team of IT administrators can administer all of these workstations or systems, they're going to reuse the same local admin password oftentimes. And you might find clusters of systems that have it, but the point is that we will use those password hashes to authenticate to every system that we possibly can and find a system where a domain administrator had authenticated to. So suddenly we have this confluence of bad conditions. We have admin access on a system. We have identified a system where a domain administrator has authenticated to. So we have remote command execution. We will compromise that system. And once we get in, elevate privileges to system, we're going to dump the clear text passwords using Mimikatz. We'll dump the password hashes from it, just for kicks, just in case it happens to be a system where, I don't know, for whatever reason, there's a new, maybe local administrator password that will be functional in the domain controller, for instance. But the bottom line is, at this point, we should be able to effectively use Mimikatz to dump the clear text domain administrator password. And at that point, I'm effectively the domain administrator. So I have their username, I have their password, and that's it. Game over. bad guys win. And to kind of provide an additional layer of context between password reuse of why it's so bad, there's often times where this is the first phase of an engagement. We'll go in and say, okay, well, we have a very good solid methodology for attacking Windows domains, right? And we learn as much as we can about that. We'll dump the domain controller. We'll go through our due diligence and perform password cracking against all these NTLM hashes that we've now compromised. And let's say we get a 30 to 40% crack rate using the dictionaries that we have and the GPU accelerated systems that we have. We'll take all of those passwords and say, okay, well, give me the group membership. With tools like Enum for Linux, you can really easily extract the domain group membership. So we can take that list of groups and say, okay, well, give me the Linux group. Right? Like, okay, cool. Well, give me every user within that Linux group. And it turns out that this is consistent. You get a list of usernames, and then we can use that as the seed for a SSH password guessing attack using all of the passwords of those users that we have already cracked. So, it's a finite subset of the whole. Oftentimes we find we have like about 1 or 2 dozen cracked passwords that are also members of a Linux group, but there is a surprisingly high percentage of the time that we can use those 10 accounts or 12 accounts to take over then the Linux end of the house. So from this one single weak account password, we can literally topple the Windows domain, and we could get our get started on trying to do the Linux end of the house, which is oftentimes AIX systems. Those are your critical, can never go down. This is where our sensitive data is stored systems. So that's at a high level why it's so critical to eliminate these weak passwords in the environment. So how do you do that? And here's some helpful recommendations, and they're really just mostly helpful. But as we kind of mentioned, we're going to beat this dead horse. No default passwords, because there's a few things we look for on every engagement. One of them is a default Tomcat instance. If you find that, you're guaranteed that you can more or less get remote command execution on that box. And it could either be Windows or a Linux system. But the idea is that it's going to be a surefire way to get it if you have those default passwords on a Tomcat box. And the same goes for anything. It's obvious. You don't want default. You don't want to have a key sitting in front of the locked door. And you want to have password creation controls. So create a unique password without any PII. Don't include anything about yourself in the password, your birthday, your name, your initials, something like that. Something that somebody could look at your Facebook page and say, okay, I can build a password list off this person and maybe get your password. As we said, no dictionary words. So do your best to kind of even, like we said, nonsense words, misspelled words, and phrases. So try to do your best to get rid of the dictionary words. Periodic changes, and like we said, this is a double-edged sword. Periodic changes are good because it keeps your password fresh, and even if it was compromised, there's the chance that it might be changed prior to its next use. The bad thing is that it tends to encourage end users to make simple passwords like Winter 2017. It's easy to remember. You're guaranteed not to repeat history, and you can authenticate and reuse use all of your critical applications. So, try to do it without reuse and make periodic changes that aren't Winter 2017. And we'll get the bottom of this list has the key to how to do that. But you want to do your own password auditing. So if you are the system administrator, you're a member of your security team, and you have a very large Active Directory domain, hack your own domain controller. It's fun, it's good experience, and it will provide benefits. So you can define your own list of, hey, these are thou shalt not have these passwords in my domain. And when you find them, you can then notify the users that are, have these weak passwords and say, okay, well, these users should be designated for additional training about password security. So it's a good exercise to do, and if you're really not comfortable doing your own password auditing and hacking your own domain, then we encourage everybody here, if you have an internal network that is large or medium to large size company, have an annual penetration test conducted so you can kind of go through this exercise and everything I'm describing on here, and guarantee that firms like NopSec, Rapid7, NeoHapsys, all of these places are going to give you a good assessment. NopSec's the best. I'm biased, but we will dump the DC, and we will go through the effort of categorizing and enumerating weak passwords in the environment. So it'll provide you with a lot of good information, a lot of good data, and you'll be able to, guide your security training a little bit better. And as we already mentioned, use two-factor authentication. If it's a truly critical resource, it can't go down, it's protecting mission critical information, use two-factor auth. That's the best way to go. Something you know, something you have. It's difficult to defeat, and it provides excellent security. And finally, algorithmic password creation. And I kind of gave this my own name because I didn't know quite what to phrase it as, but it's basically the idea of applying context to every password. So let's say I have a fairly secure password. It's like 20 characters long. It's complex. It's got mixed case. It's got special characters. It's got digits. It's free of dictionary words. But it's hard to remember, and I really can't have too many permutations of this password. So what you can do is add context to the password. So if it's on Gmail, I'll have my super secure password, bang $Gmail. And I'll use the same password, bang $work, or bang $Comcast. So it's a way you can have, one, eliminate password reuse, have a strong password, and also make it easy to remember. I mean, and really, if you wanted to do this and kind of seed it with this crazy complex password and do your bang winter 2016, if that's easy, because that does eliminate the password reuse, but it also makes it nearly impossible to guess and really, really difficult to crack. So, that's something you can do on your own, and that's what we mean by algorithmic password creation is just you can add the element that's going to be easy to remember, and the complex elements, remember it, but you don't have to change it constantly. Just change the tail end or change portions of it so it's easy to remember. You can satisfy reuse, the history reuse rules, and you likely won't forget it. And even if you went to, different sites where you're like, oh man, I don't remember my password here, but if you remember the algorithm you applied to it, you can say, okay, well, it's a Gmail. I'm going to try bang $Gmail. Maybe that's my password. Sure enough, it'll get you in. So it's a really good way to kind of address all of the risks of having weak passwords. And finally, the reality crushing recommendations. So the bottom line is that there is no way to eliminate weak passwords, especially on large networks, and it's a total bummer. And it's unfortunate, but it's true. You just can't you can't eliminate it, no matter how many security controls, no matter how much money you throw at the problem. It will never go away. There's going to be test accounts that people use during development of applications that make things easy for a team of developers to quickly authenticate. They might create, domain users for one-off purposes and just forget to tear them down and take them down. So eliminating weak passwords is just totally impossible. So the thing you have to do is really assume that a breach is completely inevitable and focus on improving monitoring and detection capabilities. All right. So there's a lot you can do in this regard with PowerShell, because PowerShell is just this crazy powerful language that gives you access to the .NET framework effectively at the command line level in a PowerShell, shell environment. So you want to do things like monitor how many failed logins are happening in a given amount of time. So if you notice that literally every single user in your domain has failed authentication within the last 20 minutes to an hour, that might be an indicator of a breach. You might want to figure out where all these authentication attempts are coming from. And you want to make sure that you're monitoring things like that. And why is this T. Ferguson guy authenticating to every system in the domain? That kind of behavior is extremely abnormal, and it's a good indicator of a compromise, or at least an attempt to compromise. So one of the tools that I really like, and I've seen a lot of presentations at security conferences for, is POSHSec. So this guy named Ben 10, and he's a red teamer, but he's mostly blue team. So he kind of calls it gray hat hacking, where he developed this framework called POSHSec, and it's a graphical front end to running PowerShell scripts. And he wrote a complementary cluster of PowerShell scripts that are going to be able to be used in Active Directory settings. So it'll allow you to know, abnormal user behavior, to know what users are logging in where. You can have these scripts defined by thresholds to say, okay, periodically run this, and anytime you see this threshold exceeded, send me an alert. And you can do this, because Active Directory is a cool thing, and it's, how do I phrase this? It makes it easy for an attacker to take over tons of systems in your domain, but it also makes it easy for a single agentless process to authenticate to every one of those systems, to query it and pull it for authentication information to determine, hey, Active Directory controller, your domain controller, show me the user activity for this one user in particular, and I want to know where they're authenticating to. And the NopSec framework helps you. Now, unfortunately, I am very heavily into the red team side and not as heavily into the blue team side. I can basically say, hey, these are the weird things I would be looking for if I was trying to stop somebody like myself. I know that this tool, the NopSec framework, is capable of kind of delivering those kinds of monitoring capabilities. I'm not 100% certain how to go about doing it. So that might be a good discussion for the next webinar on blue teaming defense. How do you monitor detection? But one thing to be certain is POSSEC doesn't prevent any attacks. It purely provides you with visibility into the environment. So because I am not a blue team expert, or I'm not really heavily involved in the defensive end of protecting networks and monitoring and those kinds of things, I've included a few links to the end of the presentation that I think will provide some very helpful introductions into how you can begin to bolster and improve those monitoring and detection capabilities. And these are all using PowerShell. So the idea is that you don't have to invest anything besides time and maybe learning a little bit of PowerShell to get your hands dirty to try to increase that visibility. So useful things from the internet. This is an entirely useless thing from the internet. And finally came to some questions.
All right, thank you, Sean. I know we went over on time, but I think there was a lot of useful information on that, and I appreciate everyone staying on throughout the webinar. And right now, I will open it up to some Q&A if there's any questions you'd like to ask Sean. And I know we did get one question during the presentation. Someone would like to know, they said, I've heard that two-factor authentication can be ineffective under certain circumstances. Misconfiguration, not complex enough. Can you comment or elaborate on situations like that?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there might be some instances where misconfigurations can result in a insecure deployment of two-factor authentication. But the bottom line is, you want to do a defense in-depth approach. So any control that you can apply in addition to an existing control. So if the existing control is just a username and password, applying that two-factor auth, even in a misconfigured context, will still go a long way to reduce overall risk. And it makes it much, much more difficult for an attacker to successfully gain access into that system. The exception would be if you literally misconfigured the authentication controller. So the component of the RSA deployment, for instance, that is actually generating these IDs to make sure that whatever you supply is in agreement with what it should be from a timing perspective. I think maybe if you could gain unauthorized access to that system, if the misconfiguration was there, and somehow I had access to that, then that would be the only condition I could see where it would be an ineffective control. But otherwise, two-factor auth is pretty good, and it provides a good layer of defense.
All right, thank you, Sean. And then we have one other question, and then we'll wrap up. Someone said, what do you recommend for next steps would be for securing an organization's password management?
It's a tough question. I think, like I said, the best thing is to, kind of prioritize critical resources. If there is something that's mission critical, I strongly encourage anybody to consider two-factor authentication on it. The other thing to consider is maybe pushing for enterprise-wide password management tools. So I know some companies use PassSafe. There's a number of open source tools out there. And what a password manager does is it provides you with an encrypted vault to store and manage all of your passwords. And oftentimes when people use these, you only have to remember one password, and that is the password to get into your password vault. Otherwise, these tools provide the capability to generate automatically a complex password of 10, 20, 12 characters, whatever the case may be. It's variably dependent on where you're generating the password for. But you can use these, and you find that people that use these password managers, they don't even have any idea what their password is, because they have the tool automatically generated. They send it in. Anytime they have to authenticate, they just pull up the tool, copy and paste it, clipboard, paste the password in, hit login, and they're in. So that might be a good consideration. The flip side of it is, I know in the Metasploit framework, they have at least they have a decent number of exploits and post-exploit modules that will focus squarely on cracking and gaining unauthorized access to these password vaults. So not all of them are 100% cryptographically secure. So it's kind of like putting all your eggs in one basket. If that goes, then everything goes. So it's a double-edged sword, but I think they probably provide more benefit than they do harm, and it is a good way to maintain and ensure that you have complex passwords. So perhaps a mandate to use password managers would be acceptable within some environments.
All right. Thank you, Sean, and thank you everyone for attending. If you do have any questions or would like to follow up on anything Sean spoke about today, you can email us at info@nopsec.com or reach out to us on our website at nopsec.com. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thanks everyone for attending.